Masechet Nedarim Daf Peh Zayin. We begin with a new Mishnah on the bottom of the previous daf. Nadera ishto v'sabur shenadera bito. Nadera bito v'sabur shenadera ishto. We have, let's say there's a husband and a wife and a daughter. And the wife made a vow, and the husband hears about it, but the report that he heard, he understood from the report that it was his daughter that made the vow. Now, this man has a right to nullify both his wife's and his daughter's vows. The thing is, he got it the wrong way around, so he thought it was his daughter's, and he said, I'm nullifying that. Turns out, it was actually his wife's vow. So, is that a valid nullification, or does he have to nullify it again? We're going to see in all these cases, he has to nullify it again. In other words, he has to know what he's nullifying. He has to know whose vow he's nullifying. And similarly the other way around. If his daughter, in fact, was the one that made a vow, and he thinks it was his wife, maybe it's from the other room and their voice sounds similar, or maybe he's just hearing a report that someone tells him, hey, your family member made this vow. Or the Gemara will discuss, is it that he heard explicitly that someone said, your daughter made the vow, but it turns out that the message was wrong? Or was the message itself ambiguous? Okay. But the Mishnah says, he has to know who it's talking about. Now, next clause. Nadra ben Nazir v'sabush nadra b'korban. Nadra b'korban v'sabush nadra ben Nazir. In this case, he knows who made the vow. Let's say it was his wife. In fact, she made a vow that she's going to be a Nazir. But he understood, the report that got to him is that she said, I'm going to bring an offering, a Korban offering. And he nullified the vow, so he has to nullify it again because he did not understand the content of the vow. And similarly, the other way around, if she in fact vowed to consecrate a sacrifice, but he thought, the report that he got is that she was consecrating herself as a Nazirah. So he has to do it again. Third case, Nadrab mi te'enim v'sabush nadra min ha'anavim. Nadra min ha'anavim v'sabush nadra min ha'te'enim. If she in fact said, I'm not going to eat figs, but he thought that she made a vow against eating grapes, or she made a vow about grapes and he thought it was about figs. So again, he's nullifying, but he doesn't know what he's nullifying, right? Maybe he has a reason why he does not want her to eat grapes, but would be okay with eating figs. In any case, right, we see from all these halachot, he has to know the who and what of the vow that he is nullifying. Okay, now the Gemara is going to derive this. The pasuk says that if a husband prevents her, here's the pasuk in its context. If her husband restrains her by annulling the vow. So we're going to read this as Davka. Yani otah. He restrains her. So he needs to know who he is restraining. So this is precise by adding Yani, by adding the word otah to not just prevent, but prevent her. So he has to know that this is the vow that his wife is taking, and not if it's actually the daughter that take it. If he misunderstood who it was or what it was, then it's not then it's not a nullification, and he has to go ahead and nullify it again when he realizes, oh, I was wrong all along. I thought it was A. It's actually B. Whenever he hears B, that's really when he is hearing the vow, and so he has to nullify the vow that then he does know about. Okay, so that seems to be clear enough, but we're going to ask a question based on this, and comparing two very different contexts that we might not think would be comparable. We're comparing nullification of vows to rending garments in mourning. דכתיב על שאול ועל יונתן בנו. Regarding tearing garments for the dead, says that when Shaul died, David took hold of his garment and rent them, and all the people also rent them, and they fasted until evening for Shaul and also for Yehonatan. Okay, so there's a double al, and perhaps they tore their garment twice, for Shaul, for the death of Shaul, and for the death of Yehonatan. Okay, so this shows that this incidentally is one place that we learn that one has to tear garments for not only a father but also a leader. Okay, V'tanya. Amru lo met aviv v'kara, v'achar kach nimsa beno, yasa yedeh kiri'ah. Now, here's the problem. There is a braita that teaches that if someone is told that his father died and he tore his garment, and then turns out he got the wrong report and was actually his son. So he fulfilled his obligation of tearing because he tore for someone who he's obligated to mourn for. So he doesn't have to tear again. He already did it. What you see from here is that even though the pasuk says al Shaul ve'al Yonatan, that one has to tear one's garments for the sake of a person, nevertheless, this is not davka. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you don't have to have in mind for that person. Once a relative dies, and then the person has obligated to tear, so as long as they tear, they fulfill their obligation, even if they thought of the wrong relative. And the same thing, therefore, should be true regarding vows. Someone in the family made a vow, and then the husband annuls it, so that should be a good nullification, even if it turns out to be the wrong person. And so that is our question, and so we're going to offer one answer. Unfortunately, in this Quran edition, they missed a line. Let's look at the Sefaria version here. See right here, we had the question from the Braita. Yasa yedeh kiri'ah, that if he got the wrong relative, it doesn't matter, it's okay. He fulfilled his obligation to tear. So amrei la kashya habistam. So it's not a question. The Braita about the tearing, that's talking about a non-specific report. The messenger came and said, oh, your family member died. And the person, I guess, hearing it thinks that, well, his father is old and was sick, so he assumed that it was his father, and he tore thinking it was father. And then he got a clarification. Actually, sorry to tell you, it was your son. So he does not have to tear again because the report that he heard was non-specific, and he was only assuming in his mind one way or another, but it was not specific that it was in fact your son or your father. The report was not that it was father. So since it was only based on his internal assumption, and not based on the report that he said, that's why we can assume that we can consider the tear to be a non-specific tear. So that's fine. The tear doesn't have to be specific. A family member died. Okay, he tears his clothing for that family member, whoever it is. So it's not the wrong person because it was just not specific. Whereas V'habim Faresh, our Mishnah is talking about a case where it was specific. The report came and said, your wife made a vow. And so he says, I nullify that vow. Then the second report came and says, oh, mistake. It was actually your daughter. Because it was specific, a nullification doesn't work. But if in fact it had been general and said, oh, a member of your family made a vow, and he says, I nullify it, even if he assumed it was one person, ends up being another, then that would be a good nullification. So that's how we reconcile it. Okay, going back to the regular, the other edition. So now this distinction we just made in this Baraita, we're going to prove that is a good reading based on yet a second parallel and similar Baraita. This one says, V'atanya, right? In fact, the he is not a question he, but in fact is a yes. We have a Baraita that makes a distinction between a non-specific report and an explicit report. אמרו לו מת אבי וקרא, ואחר כך נמצא בנו, לא יעשה ידי קריאה. The exact same case as the first Braita. A person is told that his father had died, and he tears, and it turns out later that he finds out that it's actually his son. He does not fulfill his obligation to tear. So there's the opposite verdict. But we can reconcile these to say that by saying that the first Braita is when he heard a non-specific report, then it's okay. Whereas when he heard a specific report, it was your father, and it turns out it was not, when he tore based on a specific wrong report, then it's not a kiri'ah. And this is a good reading because look at the second part of this Braita. Amru lo met v'chasabur aviv hu v'kara v'achar kach nimsa beno yasa yedeh kiri'ah. If he heard a non-specific report that a relative of yours has died, he's thinking in his mind that it's his father. and he tears with that in mind. And then it turns out, no, it was actually his son. He fulfills his obligation because he'd only made the assumption in his mind, but the report was non-specific. And therefore, we can consider the tear to be non-specific, and it will apply to whoever it's supposed to apply to. So since we have in this baraita explicitly states this distinction between an explicit report and a non-specific report, in the Resh and Sefa, so we can reconcile this baraita would be a non-specific report, and our Mishnah regarding vows would be a specific report. Okay, good. So we've resolved all the problems, but nevertheless, Rav Ashi is going to offer yet a different solution. Perhaps he's bothered by the fact that this baraita, this standalone, doesn't say, it actually uses the language of met abi vekara that's explicit. So it really doesn't make sense to have the same exact setup, same exact language, and assume that in this baraita it's non-specific, and here it is specific. It should say met lo met if you want to be non-specific. So Rav Ashi is going to have a different solution to reconciling these two baraitot that we may be able to also apply to our Mishnah. Okay, Rav Ashi Amar, kan betoch kedei dibur, kan da'achar kedei dibur. Here, in the first baraita, it's where he recognizes his mistake. He's told about his mistake within the time required to say a short phrase. The phrase is, Shalom Alecha Rabbi, a couple of seconds. So in other words, he gets a report, and it can be even an explicit report that says, sorry to tell you, your father died. And he tears his clothes. Within 2 seconds, the messenger says, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It was actually your son. So since he said it within a couple of seconds of the tearing, therefore, a statement that's within any two events that are within that short time period are considered as one, and so it corrects the action. And so, even though the intention technically at the time was the wrong intention, but because it's corrected so quickly, it's fine. He doesn't have to do it again. Whereas this second baraita is talking about a case where it was not within 2 seconds. A person told the guy, your father died. He tore, and then only 2 minutes later, he says, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. It was your son. And so then he has to tear again. Lo yasayideh kiri'ah. Okay, so that's Rav Ashi's way of reconciling these two baraitot. And we could apply this to the Mishnah as well. That the Mishnah is talking about a case where it was not corrected immediately. Someone said explicitly, your wife made a vow, and so he said, I annul the vow. And then 5 minutes later, says, oh, actually, it was your daughter. Then he has to nullify it again because that nullification doesn't do anything. But applying this distinction here, if the husband says, I nullify that, and then within 2 seconds, the messenger said, oh, actually, it was your wife's vow, that it was your daughter's vow, then it's okay. He does not have to nullify it again because if it's within 2 seconds, it's considered to be simultaneous. All right, so that's the second answer. Now, ha dekamat yasa yedei kiri'ah shenimsa beno betoch kedei dibur. Ha damat lo yasa yedei kiri'ah leachar kedei dibur. Is explaining what I just said. When we said it fulfills the first baraita that says it fulfills the obligation of tearing, that's when the new knowledge happens within a short time of speaking of his tearing, whereas the second baraita that says he does not fulfill it is when it's after the short time of speaking, it's a while later, then the correction does not help and he has to tear again. Okay, now we have Hatanya. Mi sheyesh lo chole betoch beto v'nit'alef וכם דומה שמת וקרא, ואחר כך מת, לא יעשה ידי קריאה. We have yet another baraita that will support Rav Ashi's distinction, because this baraita says someone who has a sick person before him, and the sick person in his house, and the sick person fainted, and it looked like he was dead. And so this is a relative, and so the relative sees that, thinking that his loved one died, tears his clothes. But turns out they weren't dead just yet. And they were able to then take a few more breaths breaths and only afterwards did the relative die, then that tearing does not fulfill his obligation. A person can't tear while his relative is still alive, preemptively tear, so he has to tear again. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Mishum bar Kapara, lo shanu ela shemet לאחר כדי דיבור, אבל בתוך כדי דיבור כדיבור דמה. And Rabbi Shimon qualifies this statement and says that's only true that the tear does not qualify as a proper tearing if the relative died a while later, after a few seconds. So then he has to tear again. But let's say the person fainted, and I thought that I thought they died, so I tear. Turns out they were alive at that time, but they actually do die 2 seconds later. Well, then, toch kedei dibur, within the amount of saying Shalom Aleichem Rabbi, is as if it's simultaneous with the first statement or the first act. But this also applies a lot of times when you say two statements together, right? You say baracha borei pri ha'etz, and then you remember right away that actually you're not eating your fruit, you're eating a muffin, and so you correct it immediately and say borei mezonot. That's okay. You don't have to go back and say the whole baracha because you corrected it immediately. Okay, so therefore here also, because the death happened within a couple of seconds of the tearing is a proper tearing and doesn't have to do it again. You'll see this Baraita supports Rav Asher. Okay, final answer. V'hilcheta toch kedei dibur ki dibur dameh. Chutz megadef obed avodah zara umkadesh umegadesh. The halacha is that saying something within a short pause is as if it's continuous with that statement or event that happened. So it's as if it's simultaneous, and therefore, if it's a baracha, you wouldn't have to say another baracha. If it's an action like tearing, you wouldn't have to tear again. If it's a vow, and I said it's annulled, but then he gets the correct information immediately afterward, then it's a proper nullification. So within all of halacha, many different applications, a statement within a short time is considered continuous, except for the following four cases. Megadef, someone who blasphemes God. He says some kind of terrible curse, and then within 1 second he says, just kidding, I changed my mind, I meant something else. Sorry, once you said that terrible phrase, there's no going back, and that person will be punished. Similarly, avodah zara, person goes to an idol and says, you are my God, I worship you. And then within a minute he changes his mind, and he says, no, I meant you are not my God. That's what I meant to say. No good. It doesn't matter. Just by doing it, it's already worshiping idolatry. There's no way to help it, even within 1 second. Mekadesh, if someone betroths hadat mekudeshet li, and even within one, and gives her the ring, within 1 second, he says, oh, I cancel. Okay, I changed my mind, right? Or add some kind of other clause. No good. They are betrothed. And similar with gerushin, once a man gives the get and says Hareh zeh gitech, he can't go and take it back, not even within 2 seconds. Once he gives it, it's done. These are all very significant actions that take effect immediately, and the short pause will not change what happened. Okay, those are important halachot, and now we get to the next Mishnah. Amra kunam tenim v'anavim elu shani to'emet kiyem la'te'anim kulo kayam hefer la'te'anim eno mufad ad sheyafer af la'anavim. This Mishnah is going to show a difference between ratifying vows and nullifying vows. A wife says, prohibited to me are figs and grapes that I will not taste. Okay, so the vow applies to these two things. And the husband hears about it and he says, I ratify the part about figs, right? It's good that she will not eat figs. She eats way too many figs. And when he says that, in fact, the entire vow is ratified with the grapes as well. And so once he says the figs are ratified, he cannot annul not even the grape part. So ratifying is kind of easy to do. Whereas for nullifying, if he nullifies and says, no, I nullify that part about her eating figs, then only that half is nullified, and the vow about the grapes will continue, unless he says, and also grapes. He has to specify both of them. So you can nullify half of a vow. אמרה כונם תאנה שאני תואמת וענווה שאני תואמת הרי אלו שני נדרים. If her language is a little different and she separates the two and she says, like prohibited like a korban are figs that I will not eat, and also grapes that I will not eat, because she says that I will eat. I said not eat because she said like a vow, like a korban, figs that I will eat, meaning I'm not allowed to eat them. And then she separated it and said, and grapes that I will eat are also like a korban. So because she said it in two phrases, they are like two separate nedarim. Therefore, if he ratifies one of them, the other one is not upheld, and he can nullify it. And so they're treated totally separately. All right, good. Now, manem matnitin. We're going to see a machloket about this, and one of the ways the Talmud has of introducing a machloket is to say, first of all, even though there's only one opinion that's anonymous in the Mishnah, it's actually the opinion of only one, a minority opinion, and then we'll see who the other opinions are, and that will open up the new possibilities of deciding what the halacha will be. רבי ישמעאל דתניא, אישה יקמנו ואישה יפרנו. אמרה, כונם תאנים וענבים אלו שאני תואמת, קיים לתאנים כולו קיים. Pasuk says, her husband can ratify it and her husband can nullify it. So you see the pasuk is comparing the ratification with the nullification. It also adds this, not just yakim, but yakimenu, which means will ratify it or nullify it. So we're going to discuss how closely should we compare these two categories, considering that they are mentioned back to back. So the case is exactly what's in our Mishnah. She says a vow against eating figs and grapes, and the husband then ratified the figs, then the whole thing is ratified, the grapes also. But if he nullifies only the figs, then the other part, regarding the grapes, are not nullified. That's the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. So we see that's exactly the law in the Mishnah. So our Mishnah is in fact Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer, harehu omer isha yikimenu ve'isha yeferenu. Ma yikimenu mimenu, af yeferenu mimenu. Rabbi Akiva disagrees and says, since the pasuk is comparing them, and that her husband can ratify, her husband can nullify it, and yikimenu is short for yakim mimenu, from it. So too yeferenu is from it. In other words, just like regarding ratification, if he ratifies any part of it, the whole thing is ratified. So too, if he nullifies any part of it, the whole thing is nullified. So he thinks that part is considered whole. That's why it says mimenu. Even if he nullifies a part of it, it applies to the entire vow, according to the Rabbi Akiva. All right. So this is interesting that we have a machloket Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, and yet our Mishnah in this case follows Rabbi Ishmael. Usually the Mishnah records many, many more of the students of Rabbi Akiva and very few of the students of Rabbi Ishmael. Now, as Rabbi Akiva generally, the halacha follows him. So it is interesting in this case that the anonymous Mishnah follows Rabbi Ishmael. Okay, now Rabbi Ishmael, miketib yafed mimenu. Rabbi Ishmael says, I don't agree with your derivation. Rabbi Akiva, pasuk does not say yafed mimenu. There's two separate words, in which it would mean that if he nullifies part of it, then he nullifies the whole. It just says yafirenu, yafed oto, not from it, just it. So I don't agree. But Rabbi Akiva will counter and say they have to treat them equally. And Rabbi Ishmael, you agree that regarding ratification of part means ratification of the whole. So too, since they're back to back, nullification of part means nullification of the whole. All right, good. So far we saw two opinions, but now we're going to see a third. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zo divrei Rabbi Yishmael v'Rabbi Akiva. What we saw above is only the two opinions of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Aval Chachamim omerim. Oh, look, the majority of sages doesn't agree with either of them. Makisha kamal hafara. Ma hafara ma shehefer hefer. Afakama ma shekiyem kiyem. The third possibility is that yes, we're going to treat them as totally equal, but we're going to make them equal like what Rabbi Yishmael says about nullification. So just like nullification, only what he nullifies is nullified, so you can nullify only half and doesn't apply to the whole thing. So to ratification, only what he ratifies. If he ratifies figs, then only that's ratified, and the grapes are not ratified. Okay, good. Now, so that settles that. There's three different opinions. Now, the next part, Amra konam most likely, right, we're going to follow Chachamim. So that seems to be the exercise of the Gemara here to say, oh, I know this Mishnah is anonymous, but doesn't mean that you should follow a halacha. Look, that's only one opinion. Rabbi Akiva disagree, and Chachamim disagree with both of them. And so therefore you have to take all this into account when you're deciding the halacha. Amra konam te'ena. If a woman says in two phrases, konam te'ena, that I will not taste, and also grapes I will not taste. So then that's considered two separate vows. Amra, and then certainly if he nullifies one or ratifies one, only that one and will be affected and not the other. Amar Rava matnitin Rabbi Shimon. Rava says this section of the Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Amar ad she'amar shibu'ah lechol echad ve'echad, who said in another case, a similar case, the person is not liable to multiple offerings until he makes a shivua for each and every person. Here we're talking about a case of a person who makes a vow that he didn't steal from a whole group of people, like a class action suit. Everybody's suing him. Let's say 4 people. So if he makes a vow and says, I did not steal anything from you or you or you or you, so he's all said that as one vow. Turns out he's lying, and he stole from all of them. He still brings one korban because he only made one vow. On the other hand, if he says, I vow that I did not steal from you, and also I vow that I didn't steal from you, and I vow that I do, and he said the vow formula 4 times, then he has to bring 4 sacrifices. So we see Rabbi Shimon distinguishes between saying a vow once and applying it to many things, that's considered one. And so too here it was the same. Whereas if he says multiple vow formulas, even if he's saying it in one sentence, it's considered separate vows. And that's the same in our Mishnah, where she says, separates the phrases by saying, I will not eat this, I will not eat, and that also I will not eat. Those are considered to be separate vows. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.